The text came through at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before Lily's 5th birthday, and I remember staring at the screen of my phone for a long time before I could make sense of what I was reading. Emma, your dad and I feel terrible about this, but we're going to have to skip Lily's party this year. Money is really tight right now with Dad's reduced hours, and we just can't afford the gas or a gift. Hope you understand. Love you. I read it twice, then a third time, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that hurt less, but they stubbornly remained exactly what they were. 45 minutes. That's how far my parents lived from me. 45 minutes and maybe $12 in gas, and they couldn't make it to their granddaughter's birthday. I sat at my kitchen table. Lily's handmade invitation still magnetized to the refrigerator behind me, the one where she'd drawn our whole family in crayon, with everyone holding hands and smiling, and I felt something crack open inside my chest that had been developing hairline fractures for years. I typed back quickly, before the tears could come, before I could say what I really wanted to say. No problem, Mom. We understand. Things are tight for everyone. We'll miss you. I added a heart emoji because that's what good daughters do. Daughters who don't make waves, daughters who understand their place in the family hierarchy. And I did understand my place. I'd understood it since I was 26 and told my parents I was pregnant and unmarried. Watching my father's face close down, like shutters slamming over windows, hearing my mother's careful silence that spoke louder than any words. I'd understood it every Christmas when my younger brother Tyler's twins opened their expensive gifts, elaborate toys and electronics and designer clothes, while Lily got a $20 gift card to Target with a post-it note stuck to it. I'd understood it when my parents flew to Orlando and spent a week at Disney World with Tyler and his family, posting photos of everyone grinning in front of Cinderella's castle, and then told me 2 months later they couldn't possibly afford to drive across town to visit us. I was 32 years old, a freelance graphic designer, working from my small 3-bedroom house, a single mother who'd never quite done things the right way. Not the way Tyler had done things with his finance career and his college sweetheart wife and his perfect suburban life. I was the disappointing daughter, the one who'd made questionable choices, the one who worked in her pajamas and didn't have a real job according to my father, the one whose child was somehow less important, less celebrated, less worthy of their time and money and presence. I knew all of this, had carried it inside me for so long, it had become part of my DNA, woven into how I saw myself. But knowing it didn't make that text message hurt any less. The pattern had been there for so long I couldn't remember a time when it didn't exist, woven so deeply into the fabric of our family that I'd stopped seeing it as unusual and started seeing it as just the way things were. The natural order of a universe where Tyler orbited closer to the sun and I existed somewhere out in the cold, distant rings. Last Christmas materialized in my memory with perfect clarity, the way traumatic moments do, every detail preserved like insects in amber. We'd gathered at my parents' house, their living room transformed into the kind of holiday showcase my mother loved, and I'd watched Tyler's 8-year-old twins tear through their presents with the unbridled enthusiasm of children who knew more was always coming. A PlayStation 5, AirPods, designer sneakers that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, a hoverboard. The pile of expensive electronics and brand-name items grew into a mountain of wrapping paper and excess, and through it all my parents beamed with the satisfaction of grandparents who could provide abundance. Then Lily's turn came, and she'd received exactly one gift from them, a $20 Target gift card in an envelope with a generic Happy Holidays card from the drugstore, the kind that came in a 12-pack, and I'd watched my daughter's face try to arrange itself into gratitude while the twins zoomed past on their new hoverboard, and my mother had said, "We figured she's still young enough that she doesn't need much, and you can get her something practical with that." Practical. As if my 5-year-old daughter's Christmas should be practical while Tyler's children drowned in luxury. I'd smiled and thanked them and felt something inside me wither just a little bit more. Then there was the Disney trip, the one that had happened 14 months ago, but still burned like acid in my chest when I thought about it. My parents had flown to Orlando, spent 7 days at Disney World with Tyler and his wife Jennifer and the twins, staying at one of the resort hotels, posting photos every single day of everyone grinning in front of the castle, riding Space Mountain, eating Mickey-shaped ice cream bars, and I'd scrolled through those photos on my phone, feeling like I was watching my family exist in a reality where Lily and I simply didn't appear. When they'd returned, I'd mentioned maybe planning a visit to us sometime, nothing elaborate, just dinner and an afternoon with Lily, and my mother had sighed with theatrical exhaustion and said, "Emma, honey, we just can't afford to be traveling all over right now. That Disney trip really stretched us thin. Maybe in a few months when money isn't so tight." 45 minutes. They lived 45 minutes away. And visiting us was categorized as travel they couldn't afford, but a week in Florida with Tyler's family was apparently a necessary expenditure. My mother's 60th birthday party had been another masterclass in differential treatment, held at a nice restaurant that Tyler had partially paid for. And I'd spent 3 weeks creating a custom photo album for her, hand-designing each page, filling it with decades of family memories, candid shots I'd collected and restored and arranged into a narrative of her life. I'd been proud of it, had spent probably 40 hours on the project, and when she'd opened it at the party, surrounded by extended family and friends, she'd flipped through it quickly and said, "Oh, how nice, Emma. Very crafty," in the same tone someone might use to compliment a child's macaroni art. And then Tyler had presented his gift. He'd hired a catering company to deliver gourmet meals to their house for a month, and my father had actually gotten tears in his eyes and said, "This is incredible, son. This is what I'm talking about. Taking care of family the right way." Taking care of family the right way. As if my hours of work and love and effort were the wrong way, the insufficient way, the disappointing way. My father had said it directly to my face just 6 months ago, at a family barbecue, where he'd had a few beers and his filter had dissolved completely. Tyler did things right, you know. College sweetheart, stable career, bought a house before having kids. That's the smart way to build a life. I'd been standing right there holding a plate of potato salad, and he'd said it as casually as commenting on the weather, as if my entire life was just a series of wrong turns and bad decisions that needed to be contrasted with Tyler's superior choices. I'd internalized all of it, let it seep into my bones, and reshape how I saw myself, until some part of me actually believed they might be right. That maybe I was the failure they seemed to think I was. That maybe Lily and I deserved less because I'd done everything wrong. What my family didn't know, what I'd kept carefully hidden for the past 8 months, was that my life had changed in ways they couldn't have imagined, in ways I'd been almost afraid to fully acknowledge myself, because acknowledging good things had always meant opening myself up to having them diminished or dismissed or compared unfavorably to Tyler's accomplishments. 8 months ago, in early February, I'd posted some of my design work to Instagram on a whim, not my professional portfolio stuff, but a personal project I'd done for fun, a series of illustrated quotes about motherhood that had taken me weeks to create, and somehow, through the mysterious alchemy of social media algorithms, it had gone viral, accumulating 70,000 likes and being shared by parenting influencers and lifestyle blogs, and eventually catching the attention of a brand manager at a major tech company based in Seattle. She'd reached out through direct message, asked if I did corporate branding work, and 3 weeks later, I'd been on a video call presenting concepts for their new product launch. And then I'd signed a contract for $35,000 for 3 months of work, more money than I'd made in any entire previous year of my freelance career, and I'd sat at my kitchen table staring at the signed contract and the deposit in my bank account and felt like I'd stepped into someone else's life. That first contract had led to another, and then another, and suddenly I had corporate clients, steady retainer agreements, companies willing to pay me rates I'd never dreamed of charging, and my income had gone from the $36,000 I'd scraped together last year barely enough to cover our modest expenses, to a projected $180,000 for this year. And I'd said nothing to my family because I'd learned years ago that sharing good news with them was like offering up pieces of myself to be systematically devalued. When I'd landed my first significant client 3 years ago, a small business that had paid me $5,000 for a complete rebrand, I'd been so proud, had called my mother almost bursting with excitement, and she'd said, "Oh, that's nice, honey," in that distracted voice that meant she wasn't really listening, and then immediately pivoted to telling me that Tyler had just been promoted to senior analyst at his firm, as if my achievement needed to be immediately contextualized against his superior success. And I'd felt my excitement deflate like a punctured balloon, and I'd learned to keep my victories small and quiet. So I'd kept this new success to myself, watching my bank account grow, saving everything I could, making the final payment on my mortgage 2 months ago so that my modest 3-bedroom house was now completely mine, no debt, nobody to answer to. And now I had $87,000 in savings, money I'd earned myself through work my father considered playing around on a computer. And I'd stared at that text from my mother about not being able to afford Lily's birthday party and felt something shift inside me, a decision crystallizing that had probably been forming for years. My family couldn't afford $12 in gas or a $20 present for their granddaughter, but I could afford to give Lily the birthday party of her dreams. And I was going to do exactly that, with or without them, maybe especially without them, because for once I was going to celebrate my daughter without the shadow of their disappointment hanging over us, without waiting for their approval or their presence or their validation of our worth. I threw myself into planning Lily's party with a kind of ferocious determination I hadn't felt in years, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open to 3 different browser tabs, a notebook filled with scribbled ideas, and a growing sense that I was doing something important, something that mattered beyond cake and decorations and party favors. I found a local event venue called Enchanted Celebrations that specialized in princess parties, and when I called them and heard the package price, $3,500 for the full experience including venue rental, decorations, entertainment, tables and chairs, and a party coordinator, I didn't even hesitate before saying yes, just gave them my credit card information, and felt a small thrill at spending that much money on something purely joyful, purely for Lily, without having to justify it to anyone or apologize for the extravagance. I invited everyone I could think of, all 15 kids from Lily's preschool class, the neighborhood children she played with at the park, my best friend Rachel and her 2 kids, a few other single moms I'd become friendly with at school pickup, and as I compiled the guest list, I realized it would probably end up being 25 children and 35 adults total. A real party. The kind of celebration my daughter deserved. I didn't tell my family about any of this. Let them continue believing it would be a small gathering at home with grocery store cake and a few presents, because some instinct told me that sharing these plans would somehow diminish them, would open the door for commentary and judgment and questions about whether this was really necessary. I ordered a custom cake from a bakery I'd always admired but never felt I could afford, a 3-tier Princess Castle design that cost $240 and looked like something from a magazine. I hired a photographer, a young woman whose work I'd seen on Instagram, for 4 hours at $350. I arranged for a mobile petting zoo to come for an hour, $600 for bunnies and goats, and a miniature horse that would make Lily absolutely lose her mind with excitement. As I checked off each item on my planning list, I felt something shifting inside me, a realization that I was doing this to prove something to myself rather than to them, that I was creating this magic for my daughter because I could, because we deserved it, because I'd worked hard and built something real, and this was what that success looked like in practical terms. Lily's excitement was pure and uncomplicated, untainted by the undercurrents of family drama, and she would talk about her upcoming princess party constantly, telling everyone at preschool, planning her outfit, making lists of which friends she hoped would come, and watching her joy made every dollar feel worth it. But as the party approached, as it shifted from abstract plan to imminent reality, I felt my anxiety building, that familiar need for my family's approval creeping back in despite my best intentions. And part of me still desperately wanted them to see this, to see what I'd accomplished, to finally recognize that I wasn't the failure they seemed to think I was. And I hated myself a little for still craving their validation, even as I tried to convince myself I was past needing it. 3 days before the party, my mother called instead of texting, which should have been my first warning that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. And I answered while folding laundry in my living room, Lily occupied with coloring at the kitchen table, and my mother launched immediately into a 20-minute monologue about Tyler's son making the elite soccer team, the incredibly competitive tryouts where apparently only 12 kids out of 60 were selected, the expensive cleats they'd had to buy him at some specialty sports store, $140 for children's shoes, which seemed absurd, but my mother recounted this detail with a kind of breathless pride, as if the price tag itself was an achievement. She talked about the travel tournaments he'd be participating in, weekends in neighboring states, hotel costs and tournament fees, and how proud they were of him, how Tyler and his wife were such dedicated parents to shuttle him to all these practices and games, and I made occasional acknowledging sounds, contributing almost nothing to the conversation, because I'd learned years ago that these calls weren't really conversations at all, but rather performances I was expected to witness. Validations of Tyler's family's superiority that required my presence as audience. Then, almost as an afterthought, wedged between describing the team uniform costs and mentioning something about a soccer banquet, my mother said, "I hope Lily isn't too disappointed that we can't make it to her birthday. Money's just so tight with your father's reduced hours, and we're trying to be really careful about spending right now." The whiplash of going from $100 cleats and travel tournaments to not being able to afford my daughter's birthday was so disorienting, I actually had to sit down on the couch, and I knew the financial pressure was partially true, because my father had semi-retired 6 months ago, cutting his hours at the consulting firm where he'd worked for 30 years. But I also knew that I'd seen my mother's Facebook post just 10 days earlier about their weekend wine tasting trip to a vineyard 2 hours away. The post filled with photos of them holding glasses of wine in a sun-drenched tasting room, and I'd looked up the vineyard out of curiosity, and their tasting packages started at $400 per person. I wanted to ask how they could afford an $800 wine tasting weekend, but not $12 in gas money to drive 45 minutes to their granddaughter's birthday party. Wanted to point out the math that didn't make sense, the priorities that seemed deliberately cruel, but instead I heard myself saying in that placating voice I'd perfected over years of managing their disappointment, "It's fine, Mom. Lily understands. We'll do something small here." My mother sighed with what sounded like relief and said, "You're always so understanding, Emma. That's what I love about you. You just roll with things." Then she had to go because Tyler was calling on the other line. And after we hung up, I sat on my couch surrounded by half-folded laundry and felt something crack open inside my chest. And I started crying. Not the quiet, dignified tears I usually allowed myself, but deep, gasping sobs that I had to muffle with a throw pillow so Lily wouldn't hear from the kitchen. I was still crying 20 minutes later when Rachel let herself in through the back door, something she did often enough that it wasn't unusual. But she took one look at me and her expression shifted from casual greeting to immediate concern, and she sat down next to me and pulled me into a hug and asked what happened, and I showed her the text chain with my mother about the birthday party and tried to explain the phone call through my tears, and Rachel listened with increasing anger visible on her face. And when I finished, she pulled back and looked at me directly and said, "When are you going to stop letting them treat you like this?" And I didn't have an answer because I'd been asking myself the same question for years without ever finding the courage to actually change anything. The day before Lily's party, I drove across town to pick up the custom birthday outfit I'd ordered for her 3 weeks earlier, a dress she'd chosen herself from a boutique children's store I'd always walked past, but never entered until recently. And when the sales associate brought out the garment bag and I handed over my credit card for the $200 purchase, I felt only a small flutter of the old anxiety that would have once told me this was too much, too extravagant, too irresponsible for someone like me. I brought it home and showed it to Lily, who literally screamed with delight and insisted on trying it on immediately, even though I told her she needed to wait until tomorrow. And watching her twirl in front of the mirror in our hallway wearing this confection of tulle and sparkles, I felt a fierce pride in being able to give her this moment, this pure, uncomplicated joy that had nothing to do with anyone's approval but hers. I spent the afternoon reviewing final details, checking my guest list one more time, and counting 25 children and approximately 35 adults. A real celebration that felt substantial and legitimate in a way that made something in my chest expand with possibility. The photographer texted to confirm her arrival time, and the venue called to verify that we'd be setting up starting at noon for the 2 o'clock party start, and each confirmation felt like another brick in the foundation of something I was building entirely on my own, without my family's participation or blessing or even awareness. I felt a growing sense of empowerment as the day progressed, a feeling that I was creating this magic moment for my daughter through my own capability and hard work, that I didn't need anyone's permission or validation to celebrate her the way she deserved. That evening, while Lily was occupied with her coloring books at the kitchen table, my phone rang with a video call from Tyler. And when I answered, I could see he was in his home office, that carefully curated background of law books and framed degrees that he used for work calls, and his expression was pleasant enough, almost apologetic, as he asked how I was doing and how party planning was going. We made small talk for a few minutes, superficial conversation about Lily's excitement and the weather, and then he shifted slightly, and his tone changed to something more serious, more weighted, and he said, "I wanted to check in with you about Mom and Dad. They're really struggling financially right now with Dad's reduced hours, and I think they feel bad about missing Lily's birthday. I just wanted to make sure you understand how hard this is for them." The words landed with perfect clarity, and I understood immediately that this wasn't Tyler calling on his own initiative, but rather my parents sending him to reinforce the guilt, to make sure I felt appropriately bad about their absence, to manage my expectations and emotions the way they always had. I felt the old shame creeping back in, that familiar voice in my head asking if maybe I was being selfish for feeling hurt, if maybe I was expecting too much, if maybe I should be more understanding of their financial constraints and less focused on my own wounded feelings. Tyler continued talking, saying something about how they really did want to be there, but things were tight, and I'd always been so independent and self-sufficient that they knew I'd understand. And I made non-committal sounds while that toxic mixture of guilt and resentment churned in my stomach. But then Lily looked up from her coloring and caught my eye and smiled, her face radiant with excitement about tomorrow. And I looked at my daughter, who deserved grandparents who showed up, who deserved to be prioritized, who deserved better than whatever complicated dysfunction my family had created. And I felt something harden in my resolve, a steel core of determination that pushed back against the guilt Tyler was trying to cultivate. I told him I had to go, made an excuse about needing to help Lily with something, and after we hung up, I sat very still in my kitchen and realized that I was done apologizing for taking up space, done making myself small to accommodate their narrative, done accepting whatever scraps of attention they were willing to offer, while watching them pour their resources and time and pride into Tyler's family without reservation. The morning of Lily's 5th birthday, I woke at 6:30, even though my alarm wasn't set until 7, my body vibrating with a mixture of excitement and residual anxiety from Tyler's call the night before, and I lay in bed for those stolen 30 minutes listening to the house settle around me, and reminding myself that today was about Lily, only about Lily, and whatever complicated feelings I had about my family's absence needed to be tucked away so they wouldn't cast shadows over her celebration. I got up and made pancakes shaped like hearts, Lily's favorite birthday breakfast tradition we'd started when she turned 3, and when she stumbled into the kitchen still half asleep in her princess pajamas, her face lit up with such pure joy, that I felt my chest expand with the privilege of being her mother, of getting to witness these moments of uncomplicated happiness. We ate breakfast together, and she chattered about the party, asking for the 100th time if the petting zoo would really have bunnies, and if her best friend Sophie was definitely coming, and if the cake would be the one we'd chosen with the unicorn design. And I answered each question patiently, even though we'd covered this ground countless times, because her excitement was infectious and genuine and deserved to be honored. At 11 o'clock, we loaded into the car and drove to the venue, and when we walked in, and Lily saw the transformation that had happened since we'd toured the empty space 2 weeks ago, she actually gasped. And I watched her take in the massive balloon arches in pink and purple and gold, the Princess Castle backdrop, the tables decorated with sparkly centerpieces, and the petting zoo area being set up in the corner with portable fencing, and she turned to me with eyes so wide and said, "Mommy, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." And I had to blink back tears because this was exactly what I'd wanted to create for her, this moment of magic and wonder. The photographer arrived at noon and started capturing setup shots, and I helped the venue staff with final arrangements while Lily explored every corner of the space with reverent excitement. And I felt a growing sense of pride in what I'd built here, this celebration that I'd funded entirely through my own work and capability. At 1:15, guests started arriving, and I stood near the entrance, greeting parents and watching children stream in, wearing their party clothes, 25 kids total, just like I'd planned, and the room filled with noise and energy and life. And Lily was radiant as she welcomed her friends and showed them the petting zoo and the craft station and the elaborate cake table. I posted a few photos to my private Instagram account around 1:45, quick snapshots of the balloon arches and Lily petting a bunny and the beautifully decorated cake, and I didn't think twice about it because my family barely used social media, and my mother had once told me she found Instagram confusing and pointless. So it felt safe to document this moment for my own memories and for the friends who followed my account. The party hit its stride by 2:15, with kids scattered across activity stations, and parents chatting in small clusters, and the photographer moving through the space capturing candid moments. And I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my family. Genuine happiness completely untainted by their absence, a clean joy that existed independent of their approval or participation. Then at 2:47, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see a text from my mother, and my stomach dropped before I even read the words, because I knew from the timing and the fact that she was texting during what she knew was party time that something had shifted, and when I opened the message I saw, "Why are we seeing photos of some elaborate party? I thought you said it was just a small thing at your house. This looks expensive. Where did you get money for this?" I stared at the screen trying to understand how she was seeing the photos, who could have shared them, and before I could formulate a response, another text came through. "If you had money for this, you could have helped us out. We've been struggling, and you're throwing $1,000 parties?" I stepped away from the party on shaking legs, moving toward the venue's small hallway near the bathrooms where the noise was slightly muffled, and I stared at my phone as more texts flooded in, my mother's messages now appearing in the family group text that included Tyler and my father, and I watched in real time as the accusations multiplied and intensified with a speed that made my chest constrict. My mother's next message read, "We told you we couldn't afford to come because we're broke, and you're throwing a party that probably costs thousands? Do you know how selfish this looks? Do you know how this makes us feel?" And before I could even formulate a response, Tyler's name appeared with his contribution. "Mom and Dad have been really stressed about money, Emma. This is kind of a slap in the face. If you had resources, you should have said something." Then my father, whose texts were always brief and cutting, wrote simply, "Disappointed in your priorities." And those 4 words hit me with the same force they'd carried my entire life, that familiar blend of shame and inadequacy that his disapproval had always triggered since I was a child, trying desperately to measure up to standards I never fully understood. I felt the familiar guilt crushing down on me like a physical weight. That toxic voice in my head immediately asking if they were right, if I was selfish, if I should have somehow known that spending my own money on my own daughter's party was a betrayal of family loyalty, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely type out a response. I tried to explain via text, my thumbs clumsy on the screen as I wrote. I've been working really hard and wanted to do something special for Lily. This doesn't obligate you to anything. You told me you couldn't come, and I accepted that and made other plans. And I hit send hoping that would be the end of it, that they would understand or at least back off long enough for me to get through the rest of the party. But my mother's response came through within seconds. Working hard? You play around on a computer. Tyler has a real job and still makes time to help family when they need it. And I stared at those words, feeling something crack inside my chest. The casual dismissal of 5 years of building a business. The implicit comparison to my brother, who apparently represented the gold standard of both professional success and filial obligation. The suggestion that my work wasn't real or valid or worthy of respect. Another text from my mother. We've been eating into savings, trying to make ends meet, and you're here spending money like you're rich. If you cared about family, you would have offered to help instead of throwing elaborate parties. And I felt my vision actually blur with tears, because somehow in her mind, my success wasn't mine to spend on my daughter, but rather a family resource I was hoarding selfishly. And the fact that they'd never once asked me directly if I could help financially, that they'd only told me they couldn't afford to come to Lily's birthday, seemed completely irrelevant to their narrative of my betrayal. Tyler sent another message. Just think about how this looks from their perspective, Em. And my father added, We raised you better than this. And I stood in that hallway with children's laughter echoing from the main room, and my phone buzzing with accusations, and I felt 5 years old again, standing in front of my parents trying to explain why I'd gotten a B instead of an A, why I hadn't made the varsity team, why I wasn't quite good enough in ways I couldn't articulate or fix. I stood in that hallway for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 minutes, staring at the screen as the texts kept coming. And finally, I did something I'd never done before with my family. I silenced the notifications, turned off the group chat alerts, and slid the phone back into my pocket without responding to the latest round of accusations. And when I walked back into the party venue, I could feel the tremor in my hands and the tight constriction in my chest, but I forced myself to smile as I rejoined the celebration. Rachel noticed immediately, because that's what best friends do, and she crossed the room to me with concern written across her face and gently pulled me aside near the craft station where kids were decorating princess crowns and asked quietly, What happened? You look like you've seen a ghost. And I pulled out my phone and handed it to her without saying anything, watching her face transform from concern to confusion to absolute fury as she scrolled through the family group chat. Are you kidding me right now? Rachel said, her voice low but shaking with anger. They're mad because you succeeded without them knowing? Because you didn't beg for their approval first? Because you had the audacity to spend your own money on your own daughter without their permission? And I felt tears threatening, but I blinked them back because Lily was 10 feet away, laughing with her friends, and I refused to let my family's toxicity contaminate her joy. Rachel gripped my arm and said, Emma, this is insane. You don't owe them explanations or apologies or anything. You've built something amazing, and they're trying to make you feel guilty for it because it doesn't fit their narrative of who you're supposed to be. And hearing someone else validate what I'd been feeling for years cracked something open inside me. But I told Rachel we'd talk about it later because right now I needed to be present for Lily, and she nodded and hugged me hard and whispered, We're dealing with this later. You're not alone. The rest of the party passed in a strange duality where part of me was fully present, watching Lily blow out her candles and open presents and squeal with delight at the petting zoo. And another part of me was somewhere else entirely, feeling the foundation of my relationship with my family shifting beneath my feet, like tectonic plates grinding toward an inevitable earthquake. The photographer captured beautiful moments, and parents thanked me for hosting such a wonderful event, and Lily told me at least 5 times that this was the best day of her whole life. And through it all, I smiled and chatted and played the role of happy party host while my phone sat silent in my pocket, weighted with unread accusations. By 5 o'clock, the last guests had left, and the venue staff was breaking down decorations, and I loaded an exhausted but ecstatic Lily into the car along with bags of presents and leftover cake, and she fell asleep before we even made it home, her face still flushed with happiness, and a unicorn sticker from the craft station peeling off her cheek. I carried her inside and tucked her into bed, still wearing her party dress, because she looked so peaceful I couldn't bear to wake her. And then I sat on my couch in the quiet house and finally let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. The texts from my family, Rachel's righteous anger on my behalf, and the decision that had been crystallizing in my mind throughout the afternoon. I was done being small to make them comfortable, done apologizing for success they couldn't celebrate, done accepting crumbs of affection while watching them pour their full attention and resources into Tyler's family, and I pulled out my phone and opened the family group chat and typed before I could second-guess myself. We should talk, in person. Tomorrow, my house, 10 a.m. If you want to understand where I am in life, you'll come. And I hit send and watched the message appear on the screen with my heart pounding, because I was terrified they'd refuse, terrified they'd come, terrified of the conversation ahead, but more terrified of continuing to live under the weight of their dismissal. I expected radio silence or more accusations or flat-out refusal, but within 10 minutes all 3 of them had responded. My mother first saying, "We'll be there." Then my father with a simple, "Fine." And finally Tyler with, "I can drive them. See you tomorrow." And I stared at those confirmations, feeling a mixture of relief and absolute terror, because now I'd actually have to do this, actually have to confront them with everything I'd been holding inside for years. That night I didn't sleep at all, lying in bed rehearsing what I'd say and how I'd say it, practicing staying calm and factual instead of emotional and defensive, running through every possible response they might have and how I'd counter it. And by the time dawn broke, I was exhausted and wired and more terrified than I'd been of anything in years, but also strangely exhilarated because for the first time in my adult life, I was going to tell my family the truth about how they'd made me feel, and whatever happened next, at least I wouldn't be carrying this weight alone anymore. The next morning arrived too quickly and felt surreal in that way momentous days often do, where every detail feels heightened and significant. And I woke at 6 despite having barely slept and went through the motions of showering and dressing in clothes that felt like armor, dark jeans, and a simple sweater that made me feel put together and credible in ways I desperately needed. At 8:30, I drove Lily to Rachel's house, and my daughter was still half asleep and clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit, completely unaware of the earthquake about to happen in our family. And Rachel met me at the door with a fierce hug and whispered, "You've got this," in my ear before taking Lily's hand and leading her inside for promised pancakes and cartoons. I drove home with my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly and my mind simultaneously blank and racing. And once inside my house, I moved around the living room, arranging and rearranging things that didn't need arranging until I forced myself to stop and focus on what actually mattered. I gathered my documents from the folder in my home office where I'd placed them the night before, my tax return from last year showing $36,000 in income, my current year-to-date profit and loss statement projecting $180,000, my bank statement with the $87,000 balance, the paid-off mortgage document I'd received just 2 months earlier, and several contracts from my major clients with their corporate letterheads and impressive dollar amounts. And I laid them out on my coffee table in deliberate order like evidence in a case I was building, which I suppose it was. I didn't legally or morally need to show my family these private financial documents, didn't owe them proof of my success or justification for how I spent my own money, but I knew with absolute certainty that without tangible evidence they would never believe me. would dismiss my claims as exaggeration or delusion, or somehow twist the narrative so that I remained the struggling single mother who needed their pity and judgment in equal measure. At 9:45, I heard a car in my driveway and looked out the window to see Tyler's silver sedan, and I watched as my father emerged from the front passenger seat, moving with the slightly stiff gait of his 63 years, my mother climbing out from the back, looking nervous and defensive simultaneously, and Tyler last, checking his phone as he walked up my front path in that distracted way that had always annoyed me but now just seemed sad, this inability to be fully present even for significant moments. I opened the door before they could knock and gestured them inside, and the atmosphere was immediately tense in a way that made the air feel thick. And my mother started talking before she'd even fully entered the living room, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and accusation she'd perfected over the years. "Emma, what's going on? That party had to cost a fortune. If you're in debt, we need to talk about it. There are resources, programs that can help people who've gotten in over their heads financially." I stayed calm, despite the immediate assumption that my success must actually be failure, that any display of abundance from me must be irresponsible debt rather than earned prosperity, and I gestured toward the couch and said simply, "Please sit down," and watched as they arranged themselves on my furniture, my father already looking around my modest home with that same vaguely disappointed expression he'd worn at every milestone of my adult life, as though the house itself was evidence of my mediocrity. Tyler had his phone in his hand still, half present even now, and I felt something harden in my chest as I stood in front of them and said clearly, "I asked you here because I'm tired of being treated like the family failure," and my mother immediately interrupted with, "No one thinks you're a—" But I held up my hand in a gesture that surprised us both with its authority and said firmly, "Let me finish." The silence in the room felt like a living thing after I'd told them to let me finish, and I could see my mother's mouth still half open with whatever protest she'd been about to make. But for once, she actually stopped talking and waited, and I took a breath and reached for the first document on my coffee table, my tax return from last year. And I held it up so they could see the numbers clearly and said, "This is what I made last year, $36,000. You're right that I was struggling, that money was tight, that I was just getting by." And I watched my mother's face shift into something like vindication, as though this confirmed everything she'd believed about my life. But then I set that document down and picked up the next one, my year-to-date profit and loss statement that my accountant had prepared just last week, and I said clearly, "And this is what I'm projected to make this year, $180,000. And the effect was immediate and dramatic. My mother actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and my father leaned forward suddenly with an intensity I'd rarely seen directed at anything concerning me, his eyes scanning the document as though looking for proof it was fake, and Tyler looked up from his phone completely for the first time since arriving, his expression shifting from bored obligation to genuine shock, and I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but wasn't far from it. This moment of having their full attention, of mattering enough to surprise them. I explained methodically, keeping my voice level and factual, about the client I'd landed 8 months ago after a social media post about my design work went viral, about the major tech company that had hired me for ongoing branding work, about the corporate contracts that had followed once I had that name on my portfolio, about the steady stream of high-paying projects that had transformed my business from a side hustle I did while Lily napped into a legitimate six-figure career. And I showed them the contracts themselves with their impressive letterheads and dollar amounts. And I watched their faces as they processed information that clearly didn't fit the narrative they'd constructed about my life. Then I picked up my bank statement and pointed to the balance, $87,000 saved over the past 8 months. And I said, "I've been saving aggressively, investing, and 2 months ago I made my final mortgage payment." And I showed them that document too, the paid-off mortgage on this modest house they'd always looked at with faint disappointment. And my father actually reached for it to examine it more closely, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Lily's party cost $3,500, I said clearly, and I looked at each of them in turn. My mother still looking shocked. My father now appearing almost impressed in a way that made me feel both validated and angry. And Tyler, who seemed genuinely stunned. I paid cash. I'm not in debt. I'm not struggling. I'm not drowning or irresponsible or living beyond my means. I've been building this business for 5 years, working during Lily's naps and after her bedtime and every spare moment I could find, and it finally paid off. And my voice was steady, but I could feel emotion building beneath the words. Years of dismissed effort finally being laid out as evidence they couldn't dispute. My mother's face cycled through shock to confusion to something else I couldn't quite read, something that might have been hurt or shame or recognition, and finally she said weakly, "Why didn't you tell us?" And the question hung in the air loaded with everything unsaid, and I felt my careful composure crack slightly as I responded quietly but firmly. Because every single time I shared anything good, you made me feel small. 3 years ago, when I got my first major client, a $5,000 contract that felt huge to me, I called you excited, Mom, and you said, "That's nice. Tyler just got promoted to senior analyst." And the conversation became about him within 30 seconds. And I saw her flinch at the specific memory. Every single time. I tried to share a success. You either minimized it or redirected to Tyler, or found some way to make it clear that what I was doing wasn't real achievement, wasn't worth celebrating, wasn't enough. And my voice broke slightly on that last word, but I pushed through it because I needed them to hear this, needed them to understand that their dismissal hadn't been neutral or harmless, but had shaped how I moved through the world. The room was silent after I finished speaking, and the weight of what I'd said hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. And then Tyler shifted forward on the couch and said with an edge of defensiveness in his voice, "That's not fair, Emma. We've always supported you." And I felt something sharp and hot rise in my chest because that statement was so disconnected from reality that it would have been laughable if it weren't so painful. And I turned to face him directly and said clearly, "Tyler, at Christmas last year, you told Dad I was scraping by and suggested they help me out financially. I never asked for help. I never even implied I needed help. You assumed I needed it because I'm not married, because I work from home, because I don't have your life with your wife and your house in the suburbs and your corporate job." And I watched his face flush red as he realized I'd heard about that conversation. And I wasn't done, because now that I'd started speaking these truths out loud, I found I couldn't stop. I reached for the small notebook I'd placed at the bottom of my stack of documents. A plain black journal I'd been keeping for the past 2 years, where I'd started documenting instances of differential treatment after Rachel had suggested it might help me see the patterns more clearly, and I opened it to pages marked with sticky notes and began reading specific examples with dates and quotes that I'd recorded, because I'd known my memory alone wouldn't be enough, that they'd dismiss my feelings as oversensitivity or misunderstanding unless I had concrete proof. June 15th last year, Lily's preschool graduation, 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, and I sent you both a reminder a month in advance. But you didn't come because you were at Tyler's son's baseball game that started at 3. And when I called that evening, hurt and confused, Dad, you said, "We had to prioritize," and Jacob's game was a playoff. And I looked at my father, whose expression had shifted from interested to uncomfortable, and I continued, "December 10th at your house for family dinner, Mom, when Lily mentioned wanting to take dance classes and you said, 'That's nice, sweetie,' and then immediately turned to Tyler's daughter and spent 20 minutes talking about her dance competition and her costumes and took probably 50 photos. And Lily sat there the whole time waiting for you to ask her anything about what kind of dance she wanted to learn." And I saw my mother's eyes fill with tears. But I kept going, because they needed to hear all of it. Needed to understand this wasn't one incident or two, but a pattern so consistent, it had shaped my daughter's understanding of her place in this family. March 3rd, family dinner again. "When you asked me, Dad, if I was going to finally find a real job. And Tyler laughed and said at least I had flexible hours for when Lily got sick, as though my career was just a convenient hobby that filled time between parenting responsibilities. And Tyler's flush deepened, and he looked down at his hands. And I read 3 more examples, each one landing in the room like evidence in a trial, because that's exactly what this was. Me finally presenting my case after years of silent suffering. And when I finished and closed the notebook, my mother was crying openly, and she said in a voice thick with emotion, "We didn't mean. We were just worried about you, Emma. We just wanted you to be okay." And I felt my own eyes burning, but I refused to let the tears fall yet, because I needed to stay strong enough to finish this. And I said quietly but firmly, "Worry looks like support. Worry looks like showing up. Worry looks like asking how I'm doing and actually listening to the answer. What you gave me was judgment and dismissal, and the constant message that nothing I did would ever be enough because I hadn't followed the script you'd written for my life." My father shifted in his seat and cleared his throat and said with a defensive edge that I recognized from every difficult conversation we'd ever had, "Emma, I think you're not being entirely fair here. My reduced income is real. We do feel financial pressure. Your mother and I aren't living extravagantly, and we weren't trying to hurt you." And there was something in his tone that suggested he felt attacked, that he was the victim in this situation somehow. And I felt a flash of anger, but I breathed through it and said as evenly as I could manage, "I know you're on a tighter budget, Dad. I'm not disputing that semi-retirement changed your finances." And I paused to let that acknowledgement land before continuing. "But you went wine tasting in Napa 2 weeks before Lily's birthday, and I know that trip cost at least $400 per person because Mom posted photos and tagged the venue. And you told me you couldn't afford a $20 present for Lily or the gas money to drive 45 minutes to a small gathering at my house. So which is it? Are you so broke that $20 is impossible, or are you just prioritizing other things over my daughter?" And I watched my father's face redden because the contradiction was laid out so plainly he couldn't talk his way around it. And my mother made a small sound of distress and said quietly, almost as though she hadn't meant to say it out loud, "We didn't think it mattered as much because Tyler's kids have both parents. We thought they needed us more, needed the grandparent relationship more because you're so capable and independent, and we figured Lily had you and that was enough." And the admission hung in the air like something toxic and visible, and I felt the words hit me physically. This confirmation of what I'd always suspected but never heard spoken so directly. I looked at my mother, whose hand was pressed to her mouth as though she could take the words back, and I said quietly, but with absolute clarity, "So Lily deserves less of your love, less of your time, less of your presence and attention and care because she only has me? Because I'm a single mother. My daughter gets less grandparent investment? That's what you're telling me?" And I watched her face crumble as she realized what she'd actually said, the ugly truth she'd revealed, and she tried to backtrack immediately, saying, "No, that's not what I meant. I just meant we thought you had everything under control, and Tyler seemed more stressed, and we wanted to help where we were needed most." But the damage was done, the real reason finally spoken, and Tyler looked extremely uncomfortable and said haltingly, "I think," and I'm not trying to make excuses here, "but I think we've maybe taken your resilience for granted, Emma. You always seemed fine. You never complained or asked for help or seemed like you needed us, and so we just assumed you didn't." And there was something almost honest in his admission, a recognition that their narrative about me had been convenient for them, had allowed them to prioritize their time and resources elsewhere, while telling themselves I was okay with it. And I felt my voice break slightly as I said, "I wasn't fine. I was lonely and hurt, and I felt invisible in my own family. I felt like I had to be perfect and uncomplaining and self-sufficient because the few times I did express need or hurt, I was made to feel like I was being dramatic or oversensitive or selfish." And I thought about Rachel's words from the night before, about this being about them finally seeing me, really seeing me, and I realized That's exactly what was happening in this painful moment. That for the first time in my adult life, my family was actually looking at me without the filter of their assumptions and seeing the person I actually was and the pain they'd actually caused. I didn't yell, and I didn't rage, and I think that actually made my words land harder, because I'd found a place of eerie calm somewhere in the midst of this painful conversation, a clarity that came from finally speaking truths I'd held silent for so long. And I said in a voice that was steady and quiet and absolutely certain, "I'm not cutting you off. I want to be clear about that. But things change from here, starting right now, today, this moment. You don't get to comment on my career, my choices, or my life unless you're going to be supportive, and I mean genuinely supportive. Not the kind of support that comes with conditions or comparisons or subtle digs about how I should be living differently." And I watched them absorb this, their faces showing different degrees of discomfort and dawning understanding, and I continued. "You don't get to treat Lily like a second-tier grandchild anymore. She deserves the same love, the same attention, the same presence that you give Tyler's kids. If you can't come to her birthday or her events, fine. I understand that schedules conflict and life happens, but don't lie about it. Don't tell me it's about money when it's about priority. Just be honest." And I paused to let that sink in before turning to look directly at Tyler and saying, "And I'm done comparing myself to you or being compared to you. I'm happy for your success, genuinely happy. You've built a good life and you should be proud of it. But I need you to stop speaking for me or about me to them. Stop making assumptions about my situation. Stop positioning yourself as the successful child in contrast to me as the one who needs help or pity." And I saw something shift in Tyler's expression, a recognition perhaps of how he'd been complicit in this dynamic, even if he hadn't consciously intended it, and he nodded slowly and said quietly, "You're right. I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was doing that, but you're right." And there was something genuine in his acknowledgement that made me believe he actually heard me. My father shifted forward and asked in a voice that sounded almost lost, "What do you want from us, Emma? What does this look like going forward?" And I realized he was genuinely asking, that he didn't know how to be in relationship with me outside of the patterns we'd established. And I said, "I want you to see me, actually see me, not who you thought I was, or who you assumed I'd be, or who you wanted me to become. See who I actually am, what I've actually built, the life I'm actually living, and respect it even if it doesn't look like what you imagined." And my mother was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face, and she said through her emotion, "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I didn't realize we were making you feel this way. I never wanted to hurt you. I just thought, I don't know what I thought, but I'm sorry." And I believed she was sincere in that moment, believed she genuinely hadn't seen the cumulative impact of years of small dismissals and casual cruelties. But I also knew that sincerity alone wasn't enough, that this was decades of patterns that wouldn't change overnight just because she now felt bad about them. I said clearly, "I'm willing to rebuild this relationship. I want to rebuild it. But it has to be on equal ground, with mutual respect, with you seeing me as a capable adult who's made different choices than you would have made, but who's living a good life." And I established specific boundaries in language that left no room for misinterpretation. No more comments about me needing to find a husband, no more suggestions that my work isn't real or valuable, no more comparisons between my life and Tyler's. Equal treatment and attention for Lily, including equal financial investment if they chose to give gifts or experiences to grandchildren, and honest communication about their capacity and priorities rather than excuses designed to spare my feelings that actually hurt worse than the truth. I told them that if they couldn't manage these boundaries, if they fell back into old patterns, I would create distance, not out of punishment, but out of self-preservation, because I couldn't continue to expose myself and Lily to treatment that made us feel less than. And I watched them process these terms with expressions that ranged from chastened to thoughtful to, in my father's case, something that might have been respect. 2 months later, and the world looked different. Or maybe I looked at the world differently. And I wasn't entirely sure which it was, but I knew something fundamental had shifted in the weeks since that painful confrontation in my living room. My family had been making genuine effort, the kind of effort that felt substantive rather than performative, and I could see them trying in ways both large and small that accumulated into something that felt like actual change. My parents came to Lily's preschool art show on a Thursday afternoon, just hers, not trying to split their time between her event and one of Tyler's kids' activities happening the same week. And I watched my mother stand in front of Lily's finger painting of our house with genuine interest and pride, asking Lily detailed questions about her artistic choices and taking photos to show her friends. My mother had also started calling me every week or so, not to talk about Tyler or to fill me in on family drama, but to actually ask about my work. And I could tell she was really listening because she remembered details from previous conversations and asked follow-up questions about clients I'd mentioned. And there was something touching about watching her try to understand what I actually did. This woman who'd dismissed my career as playing on a computer, now genuinely attempting to comprehend the complexity of brand development and client management. Tyler had apologized to me privately over coffee 3 weeks after our confrontation, just the two of us at a cafe halfway between our houses, and he'd admitted that he'd been completely oblivious to the favoritism, that he genuinely thought our parents treated us equally, and he was horrified to realize his own complicity in a dynamic that had caused me so much pain. And while part of me was frustrated that it had taken so long for him to see what had been obvious to me for years, I also appreciated his willingness to acknowledge it now and to commit to doing better. The relationship with my family wasn't perfect and probably never would be, but it was more honest than it had ever been, built on a foundation of boundaries I'd established, and they were actually respecting. And that honesty felt more valuable than the false harmony we'd maintained before. My business continued to grow in ways that still surprised me sometimes when I stopped to actually take stock of how far I'd come. And I'd hired a part-time assistant named Jordan, who handled administrative tasks and client communications, freeing me up to focus on the creative work I actually loved. And I'd raised my rates by 30% and turned down 2 potential clients whose projects didn't align with my values or interest me creatively, choices I never would have felt secure enough to make a year ago. I'd also started dating someone I'd met through a client referral, a software developer named Marcus, who was kind and funny and completely unconcerned with timelines or expectations. And we were taking things casually with no pressure, just enjoying each other's company. And it felt healthy in a way my previous relationships hadn't, probably because I was coming into it from a place of completeness rather than need. But most importantly, more than the business success, or the improved family relationships, or the promising new romance, I'd realized somewhere in the past 2 months that I didn't need their validation anymore. Not in the desperate way I'd needed it before, and I had validation for myself, had looked at my life honestly, and recognized my own worth independent of anyone else's recognition of it. The final evidence of this shift came on a Saturday morning at the park near my house. Lily and I on the swings in the early autumn sunshine, her legs pumping as she tried to swing higher, and she called out to me, "Mama, are Grandma and Grandpa coming to my dance recital next week?" And I called back, "They said they'll be there, sweetheart." And she grinned and said, "Good. I like when they come now, they're nicer." And her simple observation made me smile, because she was right. They were nicer, more present, more genuinely interested, or maybe I was just stronger, more secure, less desperate for crumbs of approval, and therefore better able to receive the actual sustenance they were now offering. I'd learned that my worth wasn't determined by their recognition of it, that I'd had value all along even when they couldn't or wouldn't see it. But I'd also learned that their recognition could become sweeter, more meaningful, when it came from a place of genuine seeing rather than obligation or pity, and when I no longer desperately needed it to feel okay about myself. I'd built a life I was genuinely proud of. A life that would have been good and valuable and worth living with or without their approval. And that knowledge sat in my chest like something solid and warm. A foundation that couldn't be shaken by anyone else's opinion or judgment. As I watched Lily swing higher, her laughter carrying across the playground, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever, and it took me a moment to identify it as peace. Genuine peace. The weight of constantly trying to prove myself finally lifted, replaced by the simple certainty that I was enough exactly as I was, that I'd always been enough, and that the life I was building for myself and my daughter was exactly the life we were meant to be living.